This is our shot in its current state. We still have a bit of work to do on top of it, especially when it comes to color correction and really making everything come together, but it's quite nice already. One thing we can do, for example, is to paint on top of our render to add more details. Because like the shading I did for this mountain, like, is okay, but it's not like a final shader. We still could use some details, especially if you look at the mountains right behind have some snow. So for example, we could add a bit of snow and stuff like that. So the way we do that is by rendering out one frame, painting over, then reprojecting it. And you could paint over also one of the AOVs, like the diffused GI, etc. In my case, I'm gonna paint on top of the of the stack of AOVs that is right before my 3 volumetric passes. That way I will still be able to control the amount of fog that I have on top of my render. So I have those 3 passes of the volumetrics and I'm gonna deactivate them. And this is the image that I'm gonna render and then I'm gonna paint over and then reproject back on the geometry. So this is where I will put my merge node, to which I will connect my new C node and projection setup. So you can type it once again, a C node, a scanline render, then a project 3D node, and we'll also use cameras, obviously, projection cam and a shot cam to render the scanline render. And we also need a read geo node. So the good thing is that we have a CG base here. So I'm gonna be able to use this geometry here, which is the mid-res version of my mountains here. And the good thing is that it's gonna match perfectly, obviously. So the projection will really hold up quite nicely. So that's a good thing. Using this process, starting from like a solid 3D base, but still doing a projection on top of it. That's one of the reasons I like to use 3D and push it like to a quite okay amount of details. I find that the projection work to do on top of it is really a lot easier and really effective. So I can connect my C node to the scanline render once again, the project 3D node to the regio node, and the regio node into the C node. When it comes to the camera, obviously we're going to use the shot cam to render the C node through the scanline render. So if you have updated your shot cam, don't forget to update it here. First, I'm actually gonna slightly reorganize my script because the more nodes we have, the more messy things can be. So I like things to be quite clear, even though I'm not like the best at keeping my script super organized. Still want to make an effort and make this a bit more readable. Don't hesitate to, for example, put like a lot of space between every node or every group of nodes, so everything is really clear. Don't hesitate to put, like I have here, those backdrop nodes and name them properly. Something like this, just so we can see right away exactly where our projection setup is for this little overpaint that we're going to do in a few minutes. It's also useful if you have to pass the script to somebody else. And when you work in a studio, quite often this happens because what you provide is a P-comp. So somebody else will need to take this script to use in like the master scene, in which they will probably integrate like the characters and so on or whatever. So I'm plugging here my shot cam. Make sure that it's the latest version of your shot cam and not another one. I'm saying this because it happens all the time, to be honest, because like in a production environment, you know, like always, I always try to explain to you guys exactly what happens when you are in the studio. I know that when you work freelance, it's sometimes a bit different, but I know now that by experience, when you work inside of a studio, like the shot cam changes all the time. And I know I've said that it's important to have it locked as soon as possible. I still think it's true, and especially for this course, that is really just to avoid you guys having too much headaches. Because the more heavy the scene becomes, the more nodes you have, the most confusing things can be. Let's render out our last frame and open this inside of Photoshop. So you can use the alpha here and you can copy and paste it into your canvas. Or you don't have to. I mean, I could do this inside of a separate Photoshop folder, but it's gonna be easier if I just put this like in context, I guess, so I can see how it looks. Obviously it is very dark, and that is because we don't have the volumetrics on top of it, so keep that in mind if you do like I do here, like a paint over without the volumetrics. Especially in the photos that you choose, you definitely do not want to take photos that have too much atmosphere on top of it. So this one, for example, could potentially work quite nicely, I think. I will probably have to darken it quite a lot, but it's gonna be fine. It actually works almost right away. This is really perfect. And notice how the shader that I did matches really almost perfectly the photos. That's a good thing. So I'm just cutting out chunk of the photo that I think I'm gonna use, and I'm roughly erasing what I don't need, and then I'm just gonna try to place it the best way possible, then do some slight color adjustment, mostly with the curves to darken it, adding a bit more contrast to get rid of this this haze that is still on top of it. And I can also, I usually typically don't play with the blending modes in this case, and if you've noticed, I actually don't use blending modes a lot. I'd rather use just color adjustments and maybe the blend if option. And once I'm happy with the placement, I can just mask it, fill the mask with black, and then painting where I want this photo to show up. And I think immediately it gives this extra photographic quality because our mountain still looks a bit CG, especially I think the right edge of the mountain, so that is something that can potentially work here. You just gotta be careful that if you extend the edges, you will have to maybe change the projection geometry, because obviously we cannot go above the limits of the geometry, and in this case I'm using the exact geometry that I have in my render. So what I could do, for example, is maybe actually cut the edges instead of extending them. But first I'm going to do a few color correction here. We'll work on this edge a bit later. Something like this is already quite perfect, I think. I might not need to add too much stuff. And this is just to show you guys what you could do. And from then, it's really up to you to decide what you want to change in the CG and just experiment. It can be, once again, a bit tricky first to understand how the projection thing works, but that just comes with experience. I mean, the best I can do is really to show you, like I'm doing here, as much examples as possible, and then it's really up to you to experiment, because your shot is going to be different, meaning that your camera is going to be different, so the projection setup might be completely different. So you will just have to experiment and see how this stuff works, and with experience you will start to know right away by instinct where your projection cam should be placed and how this projection thing works. So here I just changed this edge a little bit, and right away, as you can see, I think it adds a bit of photographic quality, because even though the shader was quite nice, it still had a little bit this procedural look. So once I'm happy, I can just export this, and I'm also gonna fill once again the background in black. And what I'm also gonna do, since this time I'm using a projection cam that is exactly like the shot cam with a 35mm lens, I want to crop the image exactly where my guides are. And my guides are locked, by the way. My guides represent the exact framing of the last frame, so 1920 by 804. Okay, so now I can replace this checker that I had placed as a placeholder by my paint over. I want to put this in output sRGB, otherwise it's going to be too dark, and now it should look exactly like in Photoshop. And as you can see, I can comp back in my 3 volumetric passes, and it sits perfectly in the shot. It's quite nice. Now, if you wanted to paint on top of the city, the projection setup will likely be quite more complex. Here it holds up on the mountain because I'm using like the exact geometry, and it just holds up for this camera move, but the city is a lot more busy. So if you wanted to do that, that would be more complex. But in this case, I really don't see why I would want to paint on top of the city. It would be possible, but I would need to break it up into different renders, and the projection would be a lot more complicated. So here I'm just using a roto node just to keep only the portion of the image that I want, and I'm going to use soft edges so everything blends nicely. Because at some point the projection is maybe gonna break with the camera move that we have. So I just want to retain the part of the image that I know will hold up and that I really need, which is really this little bit of paint over that we did here on the hill. Okay, so I think this is quite good. So this is how you would go along and paint on top of a render. So I'll just let you guys experiment, try to paint on different elements of the 3D, try different projection setups, and have fun.